Higher Universe Pictures.
Welcome to the Paranormal Phenomena podcast with Brandon Reines and Elizabeth Chamberlain.
I'm Brandon Reines.
And I'm Elizabeth Chamberlain.
Welcome to the Paranormal Phenomena podcast, where we talk about ghosts, aliens, and the unexplained. On today's show, we welcome back paranormal expert Morgan Knudsen to talk about the Enfield Poltergeist case.
If you like our podcast, be sure to subscribe, and we'd love it if you could like, share, and comment on our show. Those likes go a long way in helping us reach a wider audience, and we really appreciate that.
Well, Morgan, welcome back again.
Oh, it's good to be here. I'm excited about this topic. This is goody. So.
It's been so long since we've seen you.
Oh, yeah.
We need to have you on the show more often. I know we had a show a couple weeks ago about poltergeists, and it's such a fun topic that I kind of wanted to get into more of a specific case, which is probably one of the most, if not the most famous cases in the world, and that is the Enfield poltergeist case, which is in the UK. So I'm looking forward to this discussion, and let's just jump into it. And Elizabeth, go ahead and fire off the first question.
Awesome. So Morgan, can you give us a little backstory on the Enfield Poltergeist case and what it's all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's known as the Enfield case because it took place in Enfield, England in the 1970s. And it was all centered around a young girl by the name of Janet Hodgson. And she was basically started to report this really weird phenomenon going on in her house. She lived with her mom, was a single mom, and her brothers and sisters. And they seemed to be just a very simple family. Nothing too out of the ordinary. Her mom they were living on welfare. They weren't living in the best place and under the best circumstances. And they started to have some pretty weird things going on around the house. Things like furniture being moved. They were hearing footsteps. They were hearing having stuff going on all over the house. And when things started to increase and get worse, they began experiencing everything from voices to just all sorts of incredible stuff. They were phoning the police. The police were coming in. There were affidavits written by the police officers and other witnesses. There was over 100 affidavits written claiming that yes, this activity was going on. And it became a very, very widespread, well-known case in England, both in the media and, of course, throughout history as well. The SPR, the Society of Psychical Research, were the lead investigators that came in to try to understand what the heck was going on. And it went down in the books as probably one of the most prolific cases of poltergeist activity and haunting activity, probably in almost nearly in history. It has to be one of the top three.
Now, I know the case is probably most famous as the basis for the Conjuring 2, which is a pretty good movie. I didn't like that they basically made up all their own stuff. There's a few things in there that's like, okay, I remember that being a thing, but it's like same as they did with the first movie too. I don't want to get into a rant on that, but they just changed so much, and they Hollywooded it up. But Ed and Lorraine Warren had absolutely nothing to do with the Enfield case. Am I correct?
Yeah, pretty close. Yeah, they were there for about 24 hours and left. I mean, they were there as the voice of the church, to go in. Basically, the church wants to know, do we have to care and whatnot. And that was essentially it. They really weren't there very long. And the film, when it came out, the Society of Psychical Research was really upset about it because it was one of their top cases that they spent a long time on. They put a lot of energy, a lot of resources into making sure everything was done right. And it just got ignored in the film, or it played down quite a bit in the film. So, Maurice Grosse, who was indeed one of the investigators from the Society of Psychical Research, he was portrayed in the film. But people like Dr. John Beloff, Guy Playfair, all of these names that helped make this case a tangible, understandable thing for people. I mean, they were completely ignored. So they had a reason to be upset.
Can you tell us about Maurice Grosse and his connection with the event?
Yeah, so Maurice was actually an engineer, and he worked for the Society of Psychical Research as well. He was an amazing investigator, and he was involved because he himself had actually lost his daughter. His daughter had passed away, and he was very very interested in the idea of consciousness after death, life after death. So he had sort of an emotional tie into the case, but I never ever got the impression that it led him into different opinions or led him astray in what he was doing. Everything that he did and put forward with the Enfield case, the guy was really professional, and I'm not sure they got that across necessarily in the film, but he was absolutely convinced 100% that this was the real deal.
So before we get into the old man type stuff, can you just describe some more, like what kind of occurrences were happening? What are some more of the? Because I know that those affidavits you said they described all sorts of bizarre things. Can you describe some of them?
Yeah, absolutely. They ended up experiencing some really, really wild stuff. So everything from like teapots and kettles and kitchen things, shaking and getting thrown across the room. They were seeing almost like mentalist stuff happening. So like bending of spoons, denting things like kitchen appliances, metal things like that. They had Janet was actually levitated and thrown across the room at one point. They had kitchen doors and doors in their house being opened and closed and slammed and whatnot. Fires were started randomly in the house that would just show up, and they would have to quickly put these things out. So damage. Water was appearing in places that shouldn't be. So things that were, like leaking, that there was no leak. They would find these puddles and destructive, I guess, leaks, what you'd call them, coming into the house. There was a bedroom carpet that kept being pulled up all the time and bent into shape and whatnot, and shapes that Maurice was absolutely unable to recreate. So really, really weird things like that. The list is really long. Footsteps that they were hearing when nobody else was there, electrical equipment that would just quit working completely where there was no explanation for it. They were seeing apparitions out of the corner of their eye wandering around their house, just all sorts of stuff. I mean, you name it, it happened at Enfield.
In addition to the stuff you're describing, the poltergeist stuff, there's almost like an element of kind of like possession type thing. And I remember actually it was the day that I first met you, when Cynthia and I took your ghost tour here in Edmonton, and you played a clip of the recording of the little girl talking the old man's voice, and it's kind of creepy as hell, I have to admit. It's kind of disturbing, and even if she was able to fake that, it's like, Jesus, that's kind of unnerving. But can you explain to us a little about that whole thing?
Yeah, so I think this is where this case really takes a turn, and where it defines itself apart from a lot of the other cases that people have investigated over the years. And that is, of the voice of the entity was not recorded on electronic voice phenomenon recorders, like a digital recorders. It wasn't in a situation where you ask a question and then play the tape back and then you'd hear the voice afterwards. What was happening was that they were asking questions in the room, and they were getting a direct response in the room with them, and this entity was actually verbally having a conversation with them. The voice seemed to be coming from behind Janet. And so, needless to say, this sparked a massive controversy as to what exactly was going on, because immediately you think, okay, ventriloquism, she's faking it. This is a setup. This was for attention. Something's going on. We're getting played. But Maurice Grosse, this SPR was absolutely convinced that this was just simply not the case. They were trying everything to debunk what was going on. And Maurice felt very strongly, to the point where he put a reward out trying to get somebody to disprove it, and couldn't do it. They even went as far as to, when they were doing these sessions, these speaking sessions, they would have everybody in the room, except for the person asking the question, drink a mouthful of water and then duct tape their mouth shut, so that there was no chance of ventriloquism happening. And of course, everybody at the end would take the duct tape off, spit the water out in the cup. And anybody, of course, who didn't spit the water out was probably the culprit. And it never happened. Everybody always spit that water out. So there was a lot of testing that was done to try to figure out where the voice was coming from. They were testing like her diaphragm. They were the works, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't figure out what was going on. What I found,
sorry, I got to ask a quick question here. I know they in Conjuring 2, they kind of touched on that where they made the girl take a sip of water, because it's kind of like the voice wouldn't talk if everyone was looking at her. Was that real? But it's like, well, if you can't look, that just seems like it's fake. But she had to drink the water too. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. So everybody had to do it, and as far as I know, it wasn't a matter of anybody not looking at her. I'm pretty sure that was a film film element, because it was happening so regularly, and there were hours of these recordings, like hours. What I found so fascinating about the recordings themselves, for me, is I think we got a rare glimpse of one of these entities not learning language. And this was one of the reasons why I was just crazy over the Enfield audio recordings, because it didn't start out with words. And in the film, of course, it goes right into the dialogue, but that was not the case at all. How it started was a lot of growling, there was a lot of barking, it was a lot of very animalistic noises, which is something we hear as investigators with negative entities that just aren't human. There's something else, they're a thought form. And we hear a lot of grunting, growling, barking. And Maurice started to work with the entity so to get it speaking English and mimicking words. And one of the first things he asked it to say was his own name. He said, "Can you say Morris?" And the entity, lo and behold, after a little while, barked out the word Morris. It was very guttural. And it went from that to saying, "Can you say Dr. Beloff? Can you say Dr. Beloff?" And lo and behold, it started to bark out the words Dr. Beloff, and much clearer. And there was no accent to it. There was nothing. It was just these very guttural words. And then as it went on, and as more questions were asked, the sentences got a little bit more complex. We got a hint of a British accent in there a little bit. There was a mirroring of the British accent. And then eventually it actually began to form almost like a little bit of a sense of humor, where they would say, well, why are you invisible, for instance, or why can't we see you, was one of the questions. And it would come back and say, because I'm invisible. And they'd go, okay, well, why are you invisible? And it would say, because I'm a ghost. And so it would toy with them. It would have these bizarre conversations. At times it would be helpful. It would turn around and locate objects that it decided to take. And at the same time, it would turn around and attack Janet and be vicious. So it was really interesting. But the audio recordings, to me, are really key in understanding how these things work.
Interesting. I've heard there's been a lot of skepticism around the entire event, just because one of the young girls in the family was caught faking some of the poltergeist activity. Can you explain what exactly happened there?
Yeah, so Janet and I think it was her sister were caught trying to create some of these events. Just trying to get attention, playing around and whatnot. And a lot of people turned around and said, okay, that means the whole thing was fake. This is fake. That's it. And I mean, she definitely did not help herself by doing what she did. But I think the main thing that people lose focus on is the fact that the majority of these events are not something that would be able to be replicated by a girl like this. You think about the pranks that we played when we were kids and whatnot, and the extent of what had happened, and the odds of these things being done by one child it's pretty crazy. I mean, there was even 12-year-old Margaret, her one sister, was attacked and held down by something that they couldn't see. So it wasn't even like the attacks were just focused on Janet. They were pretty widespread. And people that have lived in the house since have run into the problems with this thing that's still hanging around the house. So I think people lost sight of the bigger picture, because it was easier to then put this onto Janet and say, okay, now we can, at least we don't have to understand this anymore. Our worldview isn't broken. We can just label it as a fake and let it go. But I definitely don't think that it was hoaxed.
It's interesting that you say the new people living there are experiencing this, because that kind of debunks the agent theory in this case, that it was all around Janet, because if
Right.
it didn't follow them when they moved on, it stayed with the house. That's very interesting. Is
Yeah.
that typical in this kind of case?
Yeah, I mean, I think with an entity like this, they kind of had a hotbed of a number of things going on. Here you had Janet, who she had been bullied at school. She didn't have the most spectacular home life, and anytime you've got a kid who is, or anybody for that instance, who's sitting in that kind of low vibrational space, you've kind of got a mixed bag of things, because you've got the emotions that will generate PK, psychokinesis, and at the same time you have also the same emotions that will attract something like a negative entity that has its own intelligence, that has its own state of being, and has its own way of being in the world, outside of her. So what I feel about this case, and have felt for a long time, is that we kind of had a mixed bag of things going on, where you had the poltergeist aspect of it, where there's highly likely that she was generating some of what was happening. But then you had, on the other hand, an entity that was clearly separate from her, that was able to speak, form language, and and create a general chaos in the house, and it seemed to have stuck around.
Hmm.
What do you think instigated the whole thing? Like, how did this start in the first place?
It was a good question, and when you look back on any type of case like this, whether it be an extreme one like the Enfield case, or something that's a negative entity in a house at any point, you have to go back and start to look at the family, and start to look at the condition of the people. Who are these people? How have they been living? How are they doing emotionally, physically? What's going on in their experience? And I think when we start to take a hard look at Janet, it's not really that hard to see that there was brewings here for something to happen, whether it be something paranormal, and of course, as it was in her case, or just a life of having it kind of rough. And it didn't end for Janet there, unfortunately. She ended up having a child, also very young. And the child ended up passing away, and there was like, her life was not spectacular even going forward after Enfield. So there was just a run on stuff with her that was going on. So when we look at, I think, the emotional, physical, vibrational state that she was kind of working with, it's not really a huge leap to see how this sort of eventually became attracted around her.
Yeah, no kidding. Whew.
So this old man that was like the Janet, when she was speaking in this growling voice, she claimed to be this old man that he used to live in the house, or he was a neighbor or something, and he died in the chair. He was like 74 years old, or whatever this says. Like, was this supposed to be the ghost doing it, or is this just the entity taking on some sort of thing that once existed in the house?
Well, that, and you just called it there in the second part of your answer, is it's that when we get these negative entities, often what will happen is that they'll pull either a piece of something that has already gone on and mirror it, or they'll turn around and create a new identity and build up some sort of a persona. And we see this all the time in various cases, and this is yet another one of those cases. What makes this tricky in situations like this, is that people automatically start doing the research, and they realize, oh, wait a minute, there was a Bill Wilkins. Bill Wilkins did die here. Oh, it's got to be Bill Wilkins. But you look at the activity that's going on in the house, and it's really clear that this is not an old guy looking for his family, as this was claimed. This is not the behavior of somebody who was looking for their grandkids or anybody else. You've got something here that's very animalistic. It's vicious. It's controlling. It's still learning language, for instance. So there was a lot of things that didn't make sense. And when you start to look at the dialogue, you can see where this starts to break down a little bit. At one point, the entity, as they're in conversation with it, it starts to get a little bit threatened by Maurice asking questions, and it turns around and says, well, I have 68 dogs. And Maurice is like, well, what do you got 68 dogs for? And it says, well, they'll bite your head off. And Mauricio goes, what's going on with that? Why would it do that? And so there's these really weird conversations that just start to, they don't make any sense, which is something we see with negative entities often. You'll start to ask some questions, and the answers, you'll either get 10 different answers, or the answers are just quirky like that. Like they just, like, you have 68 dogs. What are you talking about? Like,
Like
it
trying
doesn't
to
really.
talk to a toddler or something.
Yeah, really, really out of place. Context is missing. Yeah, very just lack of a real understanding about what that is or what's going on. So you can usually start to pick them out pretty quickly. It's like, this is not a guy that has been educated and spoke to his family every day, and like it's just not. They're coming up with weird things. And at one point it said, oh, you're gonna kill me. And they said, well, how are we gonna kill you, Bill? Because they just started calling him Bill. And it turned around and said, oh, by praying to God. You're gonna kill me by praying to God. So yeah, very, very strange conversations. But I think the audio recordings are telling about what Bill actually was.
So I guess the question would be, if these entities, if they knew of Bill and he was a real person that existed and they're pretending to be him, or it's pretending to be him, do they have a complete knowledge of all of history that they could just draw from, or do they just kind of know what's local to that area or what the people in the house already know themselves?
I think it has to do with a couple of different things. I think number one, it has to do with memory cells. Here we now have a new understanding about how our physicalness and physical interaction in an environment interacts on a quantum cellular level with our environment. We know that if we pick up something to handle, like if I pick up this remote, we know that there's a quantum entanglement that happens now that I've picked this remote up. It's been theorized very recently that that's one of the ways psychometry works, where I could turn around and pass this remote to, say, a really good intuitive or medium, and they would be able to tell you who owns this. And the reason why, and what they're theorizing, is the fact that it has to do with the level of quantum entanglement, because I'm the only one that's picked this up. So I kind of question whether or not it has something to do with that, whether there's, because there is memory that is left in the environment on multiple different levels, whether they've got the ability to pick up on that in the same way that you can have somebody walk in and pick up, that remote and say, I know who owned this. It's almost like they are using bits and pieces of the environment to piece something together that's going to work for them. And I've seen this numerous times. Very rarely do they decide that they're going to create something brand new. I've had a couple of cases where they have. There's a school here in Edmonton where that happened. Very famous entity that's now hanging out there, that created a brand new persona. But it's not often. They'll usually pick something in the environment that is that's familiar.
I guess that you're saying it created a new persona, so that would imply they have some sort of creativity rather than just copying something that existed. But to be able to think up a character and make up a story, that's like a whole nother level of intelligence.
It really is. And what's interesting about them, when you get into the pathology of how these things seem to work and how they seem to think, what's really fascinating to me is the fact that not only will they kind of create this thing, but when you do talk to them outside of that character, they don't have a sense really of self. They see themselves as multiple, as part of the whole, as energy, as it's really wild. And you can hear it in their language. They very rarely use the term I. It's usually we. They refer to themselves in collectives, in groups. They don't really see themselves as separate. So I almost wonder if it's like an attempt to relate in some way. I've got clients on the south side right now, and one of the things that their entity was doing was mirroring their two dogs. They had two Shih Tzus, and they suddenly discovered they had a third Shih Tzu that was really weird looking, and it would wander around their house, and they were like, "What in the hell is this?" And it was weird. It was like its features were off. It was like they knew it wasn't a dog. But it would wander around with the Shih Tzus because it saw the Shih Tzus getting attention, and as soon as the one Shih Tzu died, it passed away. The entity quit being another Shih Tzu. Like it was really weird. So they seem to have this want to mimic, to whether it be to gain trust or whatever it is, or to relate. But yeah, the mirroring of knowledge or information or identity is not new.
Whoa, that's so weird.
It's so weird. It's so bizarre. Like it's so out there. Yeah.
I even know one of the hosts, Paul Eno, on what the Behind the Paranormal podcast that I listen to, and I really like. He said before too, the kind of the seance type things or whatever, where an entity's claiming to be a dead relative,
Yeah.
and people just naturally, they believe it without question. But he says frequently when he questions it, he calls it out. You're lying. You're not dead, Aunt Susan. All of a sudden, it'll change to a different personality.
Yeah, they can't read the room at all. And they'll flip in and out just like that. There's really no there's no empathy there. So they can't always tell when the bullshit's not working. They'll keep at it until you actually call them out and say, look, I know this is not who you are. And then all of a sudden it'll turn into something else, or they'll turn around and you'll get a glimpse as to what it actually is. With Enfield, I think what made the case for me so important is the fact that within that audio, we get to hear the progression of that being created, where with normally, like what you were saying, it's just bam, you're just right into it. Kids run into this problem with these things more often than not, because kids that are depressed, they're upset, they're alone, like kids going through divorce, kids that are feeling isolated because of bullying, things like that. They really are ripe targets for something like this, because they'll get into something like that, and they'll start talking to something who figures out that it can relate on a child level, or it can be manipulative, or it can become that child's best buddy. And in my experience, that's when parents start having a really hard time, because now all of a sudden you've got this situation where your kid has this buddy that only understands them and will side with them, and it really leaves no room for the parents to get in. The number one tool of any predator is isolation, and these things will work, these sort of bluff identities, in the same way. With Janet, she was kind of a little bit of a difference, I guess, in that pattern, in the sense that there wasn't really that friendship bonding in the same way that happens with other cases. It's a neat,
Definitely.
it's an interesting case, because at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned in it, and I think it's a deep dive into how some of these consciousnesses are built and created in an environment that's just such a hotbed for something like this to happen.
I noticed in especially in the movies on this subject, it always starts with the entity befriends the person, usually the kid, and then slowly, like you were describing, slowly turns evil, basically. But it seems like in this Enfield case, right off the bat, it was just menacing. It didn't try to befriend them first or make a connection.
Yeah.
It was just flat out bad.
Yeah, sometimes what you'll get is a mixture of tactics, which I think is kind of what we're seeing here. For a number of years, my business partner Stephanie and I, we really delved into the psychology of how these things work, and because we weren't really interested in what they were necessarily, because that question's a real hard one to answer, but we wanted to understand what it was that was going on in their behavior that was creating patterns, because we were seeing patterns in these various cases. And one of the patterns that we noticed was a tactic that seemed to be used, where they would come in really, really hot, and it was all of a sudden you would go from a relatively not, I wouldn't say peaceful environment, because there's always a precursor to what goes on with the paranormal. But it went from 0 to 60 real quick. Where all of a sudden stuff starts flying across the room, you start getting drywall ripped out of walls, being hit, punched, kicked, all sorts of things, like just extreme violence. And within 48 hours, you've lost control of what's going on. Where with these ones that seem to mimic, there seems to be a slower progression over a period of time, of this sort of infiltration tactic that they use, rather than this sort of bullying, forceful tactic. But every once in a while, you get a case like Enfield, where you see an overlap of both. And but once you can kind of identify these different behavioral structures, it becomes a lot easier to deal with them, and you can start to sort of put a pin in it and go, okay, here's what's going on. This is what we need to do next.
What's the goal? What's the goal of like aggressive, violent poltergeists? Like, what are they trying to do by throwing people across the room and
Well,
stuff?
what we've noticed is the fact that it really has to do with dominance and a hierarchy. What Stephanie and I used to compare it to is almost like a pack of dogs. You watch a pack of dogs, everybody's got a space. And if once you see one of those dogs start to dip out of line, then there has to be a correction to put that dog back into line. So you'll see one of the alphas turn around and bite, or push the other dog down, or pin them down, or something like that. And when we started to look at some of these entities' behaviors, that's what we started to see was, and you see it specifically with the Enfield case, where Margaret complained about being pinned down all of a sudden, or pushed down, or bitten, or something was was thrown at them, or there was always these corrections that were happening. And whenever we see a family, and this was a great example, is the Hodgson family was a sort of a good character study for this. When you see a family that's living in that emotional chaos, you've got everybody on some level that's kind of feeling out of control. There really is no leader in the household. As soon as you get an entity like that that's coming in, then you're almost guaranteed that entity will try to be top dog instantly. It's God. They really don't like chaos, even though they create a lot of chaos. They don't really like chaos, and they will try to put everybody in order. And so the idea is that when we're dealing with this kind of a case, is that we have to get the family back into some semblance of empowerment, in order to get them into alignment, so that they can deal with this thing that has now decided it's going to run the house. It's going to fill a role. And when we've got a chaotic household, that role is going to get filled by whatever comes in that's going to have more oomph than the people in it. So that's kind of what we end up dealing with. But it comes down really to dominance and order.
It's very much like a toddler, like Brandon said earlier.
Yep.
Always doesn't know what they're talking about, throwing tantrums, wants to be the boss.
Yeah, and we'll run the house. That's the damn thing, like we'll get these cases where the families have literally turned their power over to the entity, and they're just like, we give up, we don't know what to do. Years ago, we dealt with a case where it had gotten so bad that the woman, the only place that she could sleep was her bathtub. So every night she would go and sleep in her bathtub, because the entity had her to the point where it was like, no, you get in the bathtub at this particular time. That's your bedtime, and this is what I'm doing. It was crazy,
Wow.
crazy making. But but people will give their power over to stuff that they don't understand, and some of these negative entities are happy to fill that role up.
So getting back to the Enfield case, what happened? You mentioned Janet had, as she grew up, more negative stuff happened. Well, where are they now? Are they still alive and out there somewhere? Does anyone know?
Peggy, her mom, stayed in the house until she passed away. She stayed for a very long time, and
Did
whatever.
the phenomena end, or did it stop?
It never quit for them. She was reporting activity right to the end. The people, I believe, that took the house afterwards, and don't quote me on this, but I think this is correct. They didn't have any issues, but when they moved out and the next people moved in, they had problems. So it was depending on where those people's vibration is, they're going to get a different response. But the Peggy, yeah, she passed away in the house. Janet is still alive. She was very upset with the making of the film. She was not interested at all in having The Conjuring 2 made. She went semi-public about saying, you know what, I don't want anything to do with this, and whatever. I think she's doing her best to try and let it go out of her experience. But she came up with a few interviews saying like, no, I don't want to do this. So, but as I say, she had a rough go, with losing her kid, and it was 2016 and whatnot. So it hasn't been a good run for the family.
Awesome. That was an insanely interesting conversation. I almost want to do Enfield Part 2, as a next if I could think of some more questions, Elizabeth and I will try to come up with some more questions, and then we can do another one at a future date. Because is there those the conversation you were talking about? Can you find that on YouTube or anything?
Yeah. It's there. They're all there. I'll take a look on YouTube. If you can't find it, I can send you some of the audio. So
sweet, because I would. I've heard little clips of it, on other podcasts or whatever. But I kind of want to hear that whole conversation. And
oh yeah, there's hours of it. I don't know if the hours of it are available, but I know there's huge chunks of it that are available. And they're really incredible.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show again. I know for sure we're going to have you back at some point, probably sooner rather than later. And so I guess we'll see you guys soon.
Thank you, guys.
See you. Thanks, Morgan.
Thanks for listening to the Paranormal Phenomena Podcast. See you next time.